Hello, I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for being here today. Fast Forward Conversations with American Experience is our monthly virtual series where we discuss the enduring themes explored in our films with historians and experts. Today's Fast Forward conversation explores the role of the media in shaping public perception of the murders of African Americans. It is inspired in part by our documentary, The Murder of Emmett Till, now streaming in full on our website, on the PBS video app, and on our YouTube channel. In today's conversation, our guests will explore how publicity around racial violence and murder can both force society to confront it and reinforce a system of oppression. They will discuss the responsibility and power of the media, the progress that has been made, and how prevailing narratives might change, not only to validate Black lives, but to protect them from racist violence. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the live chat and we'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsor, Liberty Mutual Insurance. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the Documentary Investment Group, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station, GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now it is my privilege to introduce our panel for this conversation. Danielle McGuire is an award-winning historian, public speaker, and author of At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, a new history of the civil rights movement from Rosa Parks to the rise of Black power. Alyssa V. Richardson is an associate professor of journalism at USC Annenberg. She researches how African Americans use mobile and social media to produce innovative forms of journalism, especially in times of crisis. Dr. Richardson is the author of Bearing Witness While Black, African Americans, Smartphones, and the New Protest Journalism. The conversation will be moderated by Khalil Green, also known as the Gen Z historian. Green is a New York Times and Forbes magazine recognized digital educator. He has authored op-eds about social advocacy in the Washington Post, LA Times, and Harvard Business Review. He has a history degree from Yale, where he served as the college's first Black student body president. Thank you again. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Thank you so much, Cameo, and welcome Danielle and Alyssa. I'm honored to be here with you today to talk about the role of media in public awareness of the murders of Black Americans. The history of violence against Black Americans is complex, traumatic, and ongoing. Emmett Till, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, and Trayvon Martin are just some of the names that we know because they were murdered by white Americans and because the media amplified the news of their deaths, spurring public protest and dialogue. On one hand, publicity can play the role of marketing the structures of racism and violence so viscerally undeniable that white society is forced to confront it. On the other hand, this publicity can unnecessarily traumatize and dehumanize the victims and the Black community, and can even reinforce systems of racial oppression. My first question for the panelists today is, what is the balance between traumatizing people and being honest about the terrible moments in our history? Did you want to unmute really quickly? Sorry.
Yes, I think this is a tough one. This is one of the things that I love to study most and discuss most because, on one hand, Black witnessing using smartphones specifically has been an incredible force to let people know what is going on in various communities that we might have overlooked otherwise. And I think when we consider the power of the smartphone and that a 17-year-old girl with a smartphone helped forge and galvanize the largest social justice movement in American history in 2020, it just can't be understated that it's important to look, and it is important to try to get justice for a family through that really forbidden way of gazing at something. But in the same vein, we're not all coming to the video with the same knowledge, with the same backgrounds or ideologies. And so I'm really excited to talk with you all over the next few minutes about that complexity. What do you do when people are looking at it in a celebratory way? What do you do when you think that the video is supposed to be liberatory, but it's really being considered like a lynching photograph? And that's where we are now, is that we're past the moment of simplifying it and saying that smartphones have changed the world and opened our eyes to police brutality, because these realities existed for African Americans before cell phones. They'll continue to be here after. And what we do with that knowledge now is what makes all the difference.
Totally agree. Thank you so much. Would you like to also provide your thoughts?
I think that, we need to also talk about the fact that why do white people need to see these forms of visceral violence enacted on Black bodies in order to be compelled to act, or in many cases not compelled to act? There is a discussion we need to have about, I think, white people's willful blindness to the abuse of people of color that we can't help but see in many ways all over social media and the television, and yet so many of us refuse to look. And I think that's been an ongoing problem throughout history. I think it continues to be a problem, and it's something we need to really think and talk about more.
I totally agree. And as the Gen Z historian, if you will, on social media, one thing that I find super important is to start with history and to start with examples that we can use to ground our discussion. So we can start with talking about Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old Black boy from Chicago who traveled to Money, Mississippi in the summer of 1955 to visit relatives. He was kidnapped and murdered by two white men after allegedly whistling at Carolyn Bryant, a white woman. When his body was found, he was so brutally beaten that his body was unrecognizable. But his mother, Mamie Till, insisted on bringing his body back to Chicago and holding an open casket funeral for her son. Now let's watch a clip from The Murder of Emmett Till that shows this powerful moment. Let's play the clip.
At a church on the south side of Chicago, Emmett Till's mutilated body would be on display for all to see.
It was on a Sunday afternoon. I won't ever forget, it was a Sunday afternoon. The church was very calm, the line was very orderly.
I thought that pretty soon the crowd would die down. It looked like all of Chicago was there.
Well, they brought the children with them because Emmett was 14 years old, and they wanted the younger kids to see what happened to Emmett. They were mad, they were angry.
And as we were led into the church, my girlfriends and myself, we walked up to the casket, and it was covered with glass. And we all looked down. This was our friend laying, looking like a monster.
They said that about 1 in every 5 had to be assisted out of the building. They would just go into a faint.
I think Black people's reaction was so visceral. Everybody knew we were under attack. And that attack was symbolized by the attack on a 14-year-old boy.
Wow, that's still heartbreaking to see even today. 50,000 people in Chicago saw Emmett Till's body with their own eyes. Jet magazine published photos of his body, which galvanized the Black community. Till's murder was a spark that helped mobilize the civil rights movement. A question for Danielle is, can you speak to how Emmett Till and the showing and display of his body helped galvanize that movement?
Well, Mamie Till Bradley's decision to show the world what Mississippi did to her son was just an extraordinary act of courage, but also, I think, an effort to not have his murder be in vain. You know, she had an open casket funeral. Like you said, 50,000 people went through that, you know, that service. But then Jet Magazine published images of his, you know, terrorized body. And I think we have to remember that those 50,000 folks who went through the funeral line, who saw Emmett Till's corpse, and the people who saw the images in Jet Magazine, you know, many of those people were folks who had moved from the South to the North during the Great Migration, and who were first and foremost, you know, refugees of domestic terrorism, right? They fled the South, you know, for lots of reasons, one of which, a very predominant reason, was because it was a place for racial violence and terror. They were terrorized out of that area. And so to see what had happened to Emmett Till, for lots of people, you know, they knew someone that something like this had happened to. It had been someone in their family, a neighbor, a friend, a church parishioner, and to see it done to a child, no less, I think was the kind of thing that really galvanized outrage, anger, you know, trauma, resentment. And, you know, we have to also remember that World War II changed a lot. You know, African Americans who went to fight the war for democracy were not about to fight for democracy abroad, and not at least demand it at home. And so in the decade prior to Till's murder, African Americans had created a pretty powerful infrastructure for activism and justice, and had called upon it again and again to push for democracy at home. You know, people like Rosa Parks were, you know, she was one of those people who had been an activist already for a decade by the time Till was murdered. And for people like her who had already been fighting for justice for 10 years, you know, seeing what happened to Emmett Till, I think for a lot of them was just a no going back moment, right? They weren't going to turn away. And then for the younger generation, you know, teenagers, children who saw those images, they're often referred to today by historians as the Till generation. Those images were so searing, so traumatizing, that, you know, many of them decided then and there that they were going to fight for a better future, and that they would be the ones to make the change. And so, you know, Mamie Till Bradley's decision to hold the open casket funeral, to let Jet Magazine take photos, it galvanized an era, really, and a movement that continued into the 1960s and resonates today, right? It still resonates. It's really powerful.
Yeah, I would definitely say that it resonates today. Some of the things you mentioned about seeing the violence up front and that motivating people to take action is something that I can also relate to. And if we're going to fast forward a little bit, in May 2020, George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, was murdered by Derek Chauvin, a white police officer. Floyd had been arrested on suspicion of using a counterfeit $20 bill, and media outlets played and replayed an over 9-minute video taken by a bystander of Floyd's murder, as Chauvin knelt on his neck while he was handcuffed and face down in the street. This question is for Alyssa. In Bearing Witness While Black, you assert that sharing videos like this one can unnecessarily traumatize people, and you call the question why it's even necessary to show them. What power and responsibility does the media have in covering the murders of Black Americans, and what traps might they fall into while trying to build awareness?
It's an excellent question. I think that one of the most powerful things about Black witnessing is that it enables the descendants of a lot of the people we've been discussing to do something that their ancestors never could do, and that's bear witness in real time. So if we think about the 3 overlapping eras of domestic terror against Black people in this country, beginning with slavery, and as that is abolished, the rise of lynching, And as that ebbs formally, but is never quite outlawed in that century, giving rise to police brutality, which is a gateway to mass incarceration. To all three of those, you have Black folks who are trying very hard to use whatever technology that they can at the time to get the word out about those injustices. So you can draw a very clean line from Frederick Douglass, who is using slave narratives as well as abolitionist pamphlets and newspapers, the high tech of his time, to tell people about the horrors of slavery. You can see him pass that baton to Ida B. Wells, who is then using newspapers and the glossies, magazines, the crisis magazine specifically, to communicate the horrors of lynching and keeping her red record, if you will. And you also see the newer generation who's galvanized by those images, the John Lewises of SNCC, who are timing their protests to when television news will be in town, because news only lasted 15 minutes. And they knew if we are going to cross this Edmund Pettus Bridge at this moment, the cameras need to be rolling on what we now know as Bloody Sunday. That then gives rise to the handy cam being used in Rodney King's filming, and as well as now landing us at the moment that we're in, which is smartphone filming. And what Darnella Frazier is doing is something that our ancestors couldn't do, is look in real time. And if we think about slavery, enslaved people could not look in real time. They could not gaze upon someone else being punished. If we think about lynching, there are no Black people in the corners of lynching photographs huddled together and watching. They're likely fleeing town in droves, and we have the documents to show that. But what Darnella is doing is saying, I'm not going to leave you in this moment. I'm going to stay here with you, and I'm going to make sure that people know your name, as well as know the person who is responsible for this. And that's one of the most giant failures of journalism in the past, is that newspapers would print that these folks were lynched by persons unknown. At the hands of persons unknown would be the party line. Well, cell phones have shattered all of that. And so that's the good part, is that we now know Derek Chauvin's name, right? He's no longer a person unknown. But we're all coming to these videos in different ways. And so whereas we think about Emmett Till being retired, if you will, those photographs being first his mother's choice to publicize, but then being retired in a way that we have to gaze upon them solemnly and we respect it. We wouldn't loop that on television. You don't have that today. A lot of families don't have control over the video once it is filmed and goes viral. There's not a willingness to then show it as an example and then walk it back in a shadow archive. And that dehumanizes Black people. And that's the other side of this, is that the consequence of having these videos, first as proof, but then later for something that becomes puerile, if you will. People are looking upon it in ways that we did not intend, creating memes out of them, creating celebratory videos out of them. That is an unintended consequence of looking, and the media are responsible for that. And so a lot of the research and work I've done is to educate our journalists about not looping these videos with the casual air of a sports highlight, but making sure that you have some kind of warning there, some kind of context. And once you have moved past that low-hanging fruit of that video, providing the fullness of their life as the reporting job is essential. And that is so often forgotten when we think about Black victims of this violence. It takes us a long time, for example, to find out that Mr. Floyd is a father. That came several days later, whereas that should have been the lead, right? What he did for a living, his hobbies, who he loved. A lot of these things didn't even surface until the trial came. And so just making sure that journalists know that, yes, something horrific has happened, but that is not the only news, is perhaps the best way to balance this. And we do this when white people die violently. We think about, for example, all of the horrific mass shootings that we have seen that have affected white people. And journalists work very hard to humanize and find out, did they have a pet? Were they engaged? If they were in college, what were they majoring in? We scramble for that information. And we never want to show horrific images. And if they do exist online, we work very hard to get rid of them, just as we did with, for example, Daniel Pearl, who was a journalist who was executed on camera. That video used to circulate widely. But that shadow archive, the scrambling to erase it from the web, was essential because it was horrible, and we didn't need it to know that something horrible happened. So Black folks are the only ones who are asked to kind of pre-litigate their own case. Prove to me with this video that you didn't cause this, that you weren't responsible for this police brutality. And once the video shows me otherwise, maybe I'll get behind it. That's what we inadvertently say when we require that proof and we use it in such a we loop it. So the media have an incredible force here. They're responsible for humanizing the victims, but they're also responsible for making sure that people know more about them than just the last incidents or last moments of their life.
I totally agree. There's even media out there right now, docuseries that discuss mass murders, like one in Milwaukee, that have done not such a great job of humanizing the mostly Black victims of this person. And it's something that we really do have to contend with. Going back to Floyd's murder, we know that it launched nationwide protests and it mobilized the Black community and some members from the other communities, including white people. But do you both think that Americans would have reacted in this way if the videos of Floyd's death were not circulated? If you could answer that question and provide a little bit about why or why not you have the opinion that you do. And for this question, we can start with Danielle.
I'm not sure if we would have seen the kinds of mass protests, particularly, with white people joining in, if we had not seen the video. I think, generally speaking, most white people are either ignorant of what happens in Black communities or willfully blind to what happens in a lot of Black communities, particularly around the issue of police violence and racial violence in general. So the video, provided, undeniable proof of what Black people had been talking about for years, about the ways in which police treat them and the violence that is enacted upon their bodies and their communities on a regular basis. And so, you had white people who would have been ignorant or like I said, willfully blind to these things, who had to choose between continuing to be blind, willfully blind, and seeing the reality. And for a lot of people, I think the video was, unfortunately, a wake-up call to, things that they had heard, maybe read about in newspapers, but had not been witnessed to or had not known, community members. And so I think that galvanized a lot of white people to say, hey, this is really wrong. I mean, it was an excruciating and violent video of a murder. And, to watch it and not see a problem. And I know some people did that. I think it is a much larger issue that we're still working on, but so many people did see it, and it helped spark some of the largest interracial protest movements that the country's seen in a long, long time. So, I think that was important. But I understand that it's a double-edged sword. It's traumatizing, it's violent, it's horrific, and it shouldn't be the case that white people need to see that kind of proof in order to believe what Black people have been saying for generations.
Yeah. Alyssa, do you agree? Or do you think differently about whether or not we would have had the same outcome if the video had not been circulated or recorded?
I agree. I think we needed it. And I think to add more context to that, it seems so far away now, but we were all in lockdown. And I think that the COVID pandemic exacerbated these feelings of helplessness amongst many people, because we were all at first watching the same channels, trying to figure out what is going on with COVID, watching the numbers rise, knowing that there are holes permanently in our community because of essential workers and others who are just dying daily. And we were already inundated with those losses. And those were incalculable as well as very palpable for many people who could not visit loved ones in hospitals and so forth. And so to have everything at a pause, where there were no sports going on, no entertainment, only the occasional Instagram live of your favorite celebrity talking about how bored they were in the house. It was a time that needed to happen so that no one could be distracted by anything else. And I think it was an unprecedented time for many white Americans to not be able to tune it out with any other programming, and to see it as often as they did and as viscerally as they did, I think was responsible for a lot of the protests and uprisings that we saw. I think if we were distracted by sports and we were distracted by entertainment and other things, perhaps the turnout wouldn't have been so big, or it would have been just African Americans supporting each other. But it was a very remarkable period in time that was marked by that pause, that global pause. And I think that everyone in the world instantly understood that the way that we've marketed ourselves abroad in terms of being this kind of shining beacon of democracy and freedom was cracking. And so you see all of these different protests across the world pop up because people are saying, what is happening over there? And again, we don't get that without the video. That's the pro and the con of this phenomenon, is that we don't get that kind of global solidarity without people being able to see with their own eyes what's happening. In the same way, if we think historically, the civil rights movement is galvanized by SNCC. It's galvanized by these organizations taking pictures of themselves in some cases and selling them to news organizations to publish in their newspapers. People were astounded by the German shepherds and the fire hoses. They had only heard tell of it. But to be able to see it and to see Black bodies being tossed about by a fire hose. And these were largely children who were protesting while parents were at work. Again, you don't get that kind of progress without seeing these images, but it still hurts. It still hurts the community that is putting their body in harm's way to depict to you what their pain has been for so long.
And what's so interesting about, Birmingham, for example, as you raised, is, and the civil rights movement in general, is the ways in which the movement itself chose to go to violent places in order to draw media attention to their cause. Dr. King, he chose to go to some of the most, Birmingham is the most obvious example, with Eugene Bull Connor as the sheriff. They knew that they could count on a visceral white reaction, a violent white reaction to their presence, to their nonviolent demands, and that violence itself would draw the media. If they had gone, as they did in Albany in 1962, and had a very nonviolent, peaceful protest movement with no white retaliation and no bloodshed, the media didn't show up for that. And historians consider it a failed, movement. And it largely has to do with the amount of media attention that they were bringing, and the violence brought the media attention. It's pretty grotesque. And yet the movement itself, in many ways, cultivated that because they needed the media attention to try to get the federal government involved in protecting their bodies and their rights in places, states that wouldn't do it.
It was almost as if they were using their bodies as bait for the media and for violence from the people that they were seeking to stand up against. And it must have been super anxiety inducing and scary. And it took a lot of bravery for all of those leaders. And I think that's something that we can sometimes forget when looking back at the civil rights movement, which we hear about so often, but don't necessarily always take that time to reflect and empathize with the people who are actually there. Sometimes, though, very unfortunately, even with all of these efforts, there was no justice for victims of racial violence. Emmett Till's killers, J.W. Milliam and Roy Bryant, were acquitted by an all-white jury, which set off an international firestorm. Let's watch that clip now.
Reports of the acquittal made front-page headlines across the United States and set off an international firestorm. The life of a Negro in Mississippi, one European paper observed, is not worth a whistle. From Boston to Los Angeles, Black people packed meeting halls and spilled into the streets to hear Mamie Till tell her story.
And what I saw was a shame before God and man. And the way the jury chose to believe the ridiculous stories of the defense attorneys. I just can't go into detail to tell you the silly things, the stupid things that were brought up as probabilities, and they swallowed it like a fish swallows a hook. Just anything, just any excuse to equip these two men.
Protected from further prosecution, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam sold their story to a reporter from Look magazine for $4,000. Their account appeared just 4 months after the acquittal.
As we just saw, media channels are also used to reinforce a system of racial oppression, as was seen by the detailed confessions to Look magazine by J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant after their acquittal. A question for both panelists is, I'd love to hear your reaction to the clip. What does it say about our media and our systems that they confessed to killing Emmett Till just 4 months after their acquittal and got to sell the story? This time we can start with Danielle.
You know, it's interesting that that article did not provoke the same kind of outrage among whites as the images of Till's corpse in Jet magazine, for example. You know, why weren't whites upset about this, complete travesty of justice? And part of it is, I think, because whites knew the system was designed for them. They knew that Bryant and Milam murdered Emmett Till, and they, I assume, figured it was okay, because if they did kill Till, then they probably assumed, well, Till had it coming. You know, that's what you saw in the documentary of white people saying. They made, like maybe Till Bradley said, they made up all kinds of reasons to justify the murder of Emmett Till. And so, in some ways, African Americans didn't need Look magazine to tell them that Bryant and Milam were lying and that they had actually murdered Emmett Till. And so, the question is, who was that for? Who was that for? I think it's interesting. But it definitely reinforces the assumption, the belief and the system of white supremacy and the ways in which, the justice system is wired to support it.
Totally agree.
I would add to that when you say, who is that for? I think that's so poignant, because a lot of today's media that loop on social media enrich the social media platforms while they deplete the spirit of Black Americans. And so even though every time you may click on that, or you may purchase a shirt that rolls right underneath it that maybe says Black Lives Matter, maybe you bought some merch during that time, no one who needs to receive that funding is receiving that funding. The families, for example, who have to do the gargantuan task of healing afterwards aren't compensated with every click. They don't receive funding for those things. And I think a lot of the times we are so focused on the image itself that we're not questioning who stands to profit from it. News organizations profit immensely when they publish these ghastly images on the front page of a newspaper or on a magazine, or even if they roll them and have all of these different programs and people arguing with each other on cable television in the evenings. All of that is a huge financial engine that continues to roll. And a lot of folks are starting to turn away from that with those realizations, knowing that I'm not going to participate in this anymore. I'm not going to watch these things. And so in 2020, you heard a lot of African Americans say, I'm not going to watch any of this kind of traumatic footage anymore. I'm not going to support this. And in fact, if they did try to put a counter narrative out or talk about the ways they were protesting, that was in fact shadow banned by major social networks, who eventually had to apologize for doing so quite publicly and embarrassingly. So I think these owners of these companies know very well that the old journalism adage, if it bleeds, it leads, is almost unilaterally applied to African American suffering, and it is rolled back and questioned for everyone else. So it's worth questioning whether we should continue to broadcast these things if the families are not in alignment with it. And a lot of times families aren't even asked in the way that Miss Mamie was.
To your point, for anyone who doesn't know what shadow banning is, it's when someone might post a video. For example, in my case, I've made social media 1-minute videos about important history lessons or about activism in the Black community. And although normally a video that I could post might reach 10,000 or even 100,000 people, for some reason, there's a very clear pattern that videos about activism and some topics like George Floyd were throughout all of the social media getting less and less views, sometimes getting 0 for hours on end, or just 10 or 15 from people who usually get thousands of views. And it's really weird because the suppression is something that's hard to quantify and prove, but we kind of all know it's there. So that's a really interesting dynamic that we have to also factor in to media in the future and these topics that we're talking about right now. Before we go more into the future, I just wanted to definitely get a chance to throw it to Danielle to just talk a little bit more about what happened after this with Emmett Till's case, and how has that lack of accountability for his murder helped his story resonate with more murders of Black Americans?
You know, after the acquittals and then the Jet magazine article, Mamie Till Bradley did go on a national speaking tour and, talked about her son and what had happened. We saw a little bit of that in the clip that you just showed. And that helped raise a lot of money for the NAACP. But it didn't bring the family justice. And over the years, there have been numerous attempts to try to reopen the case, to hold, for example, Carolyn Bryant accountable. The federal government reopened the case, I think, in 2004, and they found the old trial transcript. They dug into it, but a grand jury refused to indict anyone. In 2007, it was reopened again with new information. Again, it was closed. More recently, in 2017 or 18, the Justice Department reopened the case after a book was written by Tim Tyson, who's been the only historian to interview Carolyn Bryant, who, Tyson said that when he interviewed her, she told him that the story about Emmett Till whistling at her, grabbing her, was not true. She, of course, denied that when the FBI came knocking at her door, asking questions. And so once again, a grand jury refused to bring her forward for an indictment and close the case again. This summer, an old warrant was found that was never served upon her in 1955, and it renewed hopes among surviving family members that finally they would issue the warrant and bring an arrest or something, and that didn't happen. And so it's been decades of trying to bring some kind of justice to the family without success, despite federal efforts to reopen cold case civil rights murders, civil rights era murders. There was a law passed and funding provided for the Justice Department to look into murders that happened before 1970 that were unsolved or were not properly prosecuted. That has not resulted in any kind of success for the Till family. There's a federal anti-lynching bill just passed at the same time that they refused to bring Carolyn Bryant forward on that old arrest warrant. So, there has been just extraordinary effort in this case to hold somebody accountable for Emmett Till's death, and it has largely failed. So there's never been justice in this case. But I do think that it's so important to continue to tell the story and to teach the history, because so much of what is happening today is related to those unpunished crimes in the past. And until we actually hold people accountable for the crimes that they commit, they will continue. And so the quest for justice is important. The history is necessary if we want to change the future.
I totally agree with what you're saying. And I think it's really important to note that even though Miss Mamie Till Mobley is no longer with us, a lot of the efforts to continue to raise awareness about Emmett Till and what happened to him are coming from family members. Mamie Till Mobley's cousin, Deborah Watts, is leader of the Emmett Till Legacy Foundation, and they're the ones who went down to the South, to these courthouses, to the basements of them. I've talked to her directly and heard this account where they found the records and they found those documents. And it just goes to show that that familial bond and that family, the Till family, is really strong and brave and persistent. And they're the ones really leading the charge. And I think that's something that's super, super, super admirable. As we know, even though there might not be justice for Emmett Till that has come in the decades since, there's been some progress made, at least at a general level, when it comes to combating and outlawing racial violence. We know George Floyd's killer was found guilty, Derek Chauvin, of unintentional second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. But would you say in this case, even with the difference between what happened with Emmett Till's murderers and George Floyd's, was justice served to the Floyd family? This I'm going to start with Danielle again.
Was justice served? I mean, I think justice would be a society where something like this doesn't happen, right? Where Black people aren't targeted by the police. But at least in that case, there was some measure of accountability and acknowledgement that someone else was responsible for his death. I think that's important, right? There needs to be accountability in these cases, but justice is a tough word, right? It has a lot of different meanings, and I don't know if, when your child is stolen from you in that way, and their life is so meaningless to those who are sworn to protect it. I'm not sure justice is possible in those scenarios. Justice to me would be, like I said, not having that kind of system in place in the first place, a world without white supremacy and violence. But if that's not possible, then, what kind of reparations is the family going to get? What kind of reparations is there for the community? What change is actually going to happen? And I know that there are some people working on those things, but we need more, right? Justice would need more change, real change, not talking points, not posters, not a training session, right? More, a lot more systematic change.
And Alyssa, would you want to expand a little bit on that, or share a perspective you have?
Yes, justice to me seems like we need a wholesale rebranding of Blackness and Black life in America. I think a lot of these instances occur because Black people have been branded, stamped, to borrow Dr. Ibram Kendi's phrase, stamped from the beginning as something evil or bad and abhorrent, if you will. And I think it is aberrant when white folks behave in ways that are evil. And that's why you see this celebrity treatment of the serial killer you referenced at the top of our call in Milwaukee. This person was allowed to terrorize a community for decades. And the police knew in many cases and was aware of what was going on. And in many cases did not believe the people of color who were trying to let them know that there is harm coming to our community members. And in fact, the court transcripts reflect a judge even saying, "You remind me of my grandson, so I'm not going to give you a very harsh penalty for killing this young man." And so that kind of grace, if you will, is never, ever extended to Black people doing ordinary things. Mr. Floyd was not convicted or not even accused of killing anyone. He was floating a $20 bill during a pandemic when many people were not working, allegedly, right? If we think about Alton Sterling selling DVDs outside of a bodega, allegedly, gets you killed. Eric Garner selling loose cigarettes, allegedly, gets you killed. Why is it that someone who actually is killing many, many people and a string of deaths, a serial killer, if you will, is given such freedom, such a measure of being unsurveilled, if you will, by police, so far under the radar, not even being looked at by police, that you can do some of the most heinous things that a human being can ever do? Yet Black folks who are just doing ordinary things or committing these so-called crimes of opportunity or poverty deserve death. That's the real heart of the question, is that we're saying that one group of people, when they do something unlawful, should get the Hollywood treatment, the true crime treatment, the celebrity treatment for 30 years later, all kinds of series devoted to them. Whereas the person who was just living their life and struggling through it should not receive some measure of humanity in the way that they're covered. And that is a very tough conversation to have. A lot of people don't want to have that conversation. But it all goes back to the assumption that if a white person is misbehaving, something went wrong. Let's figure out what happened here. Was it video games? Was it the way that they were brought up? Did they just need a hug or something? And what happened here? There's never that grace extended, because it's assumed that when a Black person is caught by police that they deserved it. And we'll fill in the details later. And it's what led to, if we think about the Central Park Five, now known as the Exonerated Five, we cannot talk about the impact of media and crime and Black life without thinking about their case and how the media ran away with those stories and did not allow the young men to get a fair trial. And in fact, a newspaper was used to take out a full-page ad calling for their death. You know, our former president called for their death. And that death penalty was being asked for because a white woman was raped in Central Park. And even though later on it was proven that the five boys were not involved in it, the media, I don't think, have ever sufficiently apologized for the circus that they created that swept up that frenzy, if you will. And if we think about the same locus, Central Park, yet again, the complexity here is that Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper in Central Park, you have Christian Cooper being saved by his smartphone in Central Park, the same location where the Central Park Five would have been confronted with racism and media bias, right? And so because he's taking out his cell phone while bird watching and telling this lady, please put your dog back on a leash, they're not allowed to be off lead here, and she's reacting and performing and saying, I'm going to tell police that you were harassing me. Because all of that is on video, we don't get the same outcome that we get with Emmett Till. And African Americans connected those dots immediately. They said, what if Emmett Till would have had a video camera? What if his cousins in that shop would have been able to produce footage that said, he did not whistle at you, he did not grope you? Christian Cooper has something Emmett Till didn't, and that's that cell phone. And it's probably why a lot of people believe he's alive today, is because he was able to prove that what Amy Cooper said happened did not happen. And so we have to call these, and a lot of the things that we are seeing now through cell phones make it quite embarrassing for people who are trying to cause harm in this way, because you never know who's filming and who's watching. But again, it's very difficult to grapple with that fact that Black people have to do that in the first place, because we're seen as inherently bad and not a one-off in the way that a serial killer would be.
Yeah. And even today, though, there are definitely moments where there are Black Americans who face very lethal cases of racial violence, and don't necessarily have the ability to record it, whether or not it's that they don't have a phone on them at the moment, or it was an ambush and it was a moment where they didn't even have time to think about getting anything in terms of footage. One of those cases is very obviously the death and murder of Breonna Taylor. And I want to ask you, Alyssa, to throw it back to you. How do you contrast what happened with Breonna Taylor from what happened with George Floyd? We never saw the shooting, at least in terms of footage. We never saw the body. And some might even feel it made the case seem less important or less believable, at least within the dominant culture. Is this how you feel? What perspective do you have?
I thought her case was especially harrowing. It is one that actually gave me nightmares, because I thought, if you can be in your own home and be attacked that way, and then for people to actively try to turn your own mom away from the scene. Her mom was directed to a hospital, and they knew that she wasn't even there. She wasn't in the hospital. She was still in the apartment. And so that struck a chord with me as a mother. I can't imagine trying to get into my daughter's apartment to see if she's okay, being told she's in a hospital, go to the hospital, realize she's not there, and you're being thrown back and forth as they try to get their story together. And I think that resonated with a lot of African Americans, which is why you saw so many different depictions of her, not only on the cover of Oprah magazine or a special edition in Vanity Fairs, because we all understood that you can't even be at home minding your own business if that is the force that is after you. And I think that even though the video was not there, another thing Black people understood is that a lot of police violence against Black women does occur under the cover of night. It often is not filmed. And if we think about the various cases of police breaking into or doing no-knock warrants into people's homes and the Say Her Name movement that sprang up out of that, right? It occurred because a lot of these things that you're talking about, as you said, are not filmed because people didn't have time to. They're in their own home, minding their business when a battering ram comes through. And if they are an elder of ours and they suffer a heart attack, that gets counted in the Say Her Name movement as an act of police brutality, right? But again, because those videos aren't there, sometimes the women don't rise to the level of household names. But I think the Breonna Taylor case is a striking example that we don't need video to know when something is wrong. The nation rallied around her cause without seeing it. And in fact, her case preceded Mr. Floyd's, and in many cases sprang up and started to get even more legs after his killing because people said, don't forget about her. So there are just so many cases, even with Sandra Bland, if we think about her not being killed on camera, the mystery that still surrounds what happened to her in that jail is enough. And a lot of people are still calling for change, still calling for some kind of justice for her family, reparations for her family. And we didn't have a video of the complete act, but we still know something is amiss. So again, I think we can still get to justice without the videos. We just have to want to, and we have to be willing to, again, going back to my last point, see Black people not as inherently evil, but as full, complex human beings who deserve an investigation when their lives are taken in an untimely way.
I think it's really important.
Go ahead.
I think it's really important that you raise the Say Her Name movement, because one of the problems with the media in general is that it tends to ignore women of color, right? And the things that happen to them. And so the Say Her Name movement has been really instrumental in bringing to the public's attention police violence against Black women in particular, but other women of color as well. And without that movement, I think we wouldn't see so many cases in the public eye like Breonna Taylor's case, because the media is largely guilty of ignoring Black women's experiences, and you know, and that's been a historic problem as well. And so, you know, like you said, we need to see these things. We don't need the video, but we do need people who care, and people can force prosecutors, the public in general, to pay attention. And that's what the Say Her Name movement has done. I think it's really great.
Yeah, and it comes in contrast to other phenomena that we know of, like the missing white woman like phenomenon, or missing white woman syndrome. I forgot what it's called, but it basically describes how when there's a missing white woman, especially if they're young, especially if they fit traditional beauty standards, it turns into a whole media frenzy, and you won't stop hearing coverage until both the murderer and the body is found. And this happened just last year, I think early last year, with a famous influencer who was tragically murdered by her boyfriend. But seeing that, how that was handled, is something that we don't, of course, want less of. We don't want these cases not to be covered, but we want the same equitable coverage for people from other demographics. I think that's what's really important. I have one more question, and it's directed for both of you, but I really want to ask, and I'm really wondering, how can we continue to change our institutions in order to protect Black lives and prevent the brutal racist hatred and violence that continues to affect Black Americans? I'm going to start with Danielle, and I'm going to end with Alyssa.
You know, I think that we need to continue to put pressure on our government leaders, our prosecutors, our attorney generals, anyone in that, realm to properly prosecute cases of hatred and violence, racial violence. I think that we need to continue to push for the full humanity and dignity and of Black people and other people of color and people who are on the margins of our society, and that the people with the most power and the most privilege need to be out front doing that, and to use their power and privilege for that purpose. There's so much we have to do. There's so much we can do. And I know it can feel really overwhelming, and you feel like maybe you can't change the world, but I think that's where the civil rights movement can really be a tool and a guide for those of us who want change. The movement is there for us to study, and the tools are available for us to deploy. Mamie Till Bradley is a perfect example of the power of one person to help change a nation's mind. And so many other people have forged that path. And I think we need to do more of that. We need to demand more. We need to, demand that the United States live up to its promise of freedom and equality. And until it does that, we need to fight for it.
Thank you so much. I'll pass it to Alyssa.
And I would add that local politics, local government are essential in stamping out a lot of the violence that we're seeing. A lot of people may not know that they can vote out a sheriff that they don't agree with. A lot of people don't even think about down ballot, all of the folks who are making decisions that impact their lives in a more intimate way every single day. So while it is important to vote for national elections, the local ones, the midterms that no one thinks or cares about are very important to participate in. I think it's also important too to believe people the first time when they're showing you who they are. So in our city right now in Los Angeles, we have a very unfortunate incident of city council members who said some very harmful things about Black Americans. And a lot of times we like to paint this dichotomy that the world that we live in, or America, is this Black versus white, right? But anti-Black racism is a huge problem, not just amongst white Americans, but all Americans, I would argue. And I think recognizing that anti-Black racism, that unique format, and making sure that your everyday interactions with Black people are equitable and fair go a very long way, especially not if you're just a public figure, but an everyday person can have biases, and checking those constantly, and then making sure that you're voting in alignment with ways that will improve things in your state or in your city, I think are incredibly important. Again, so I think just recognizing this Emmett Till legacy and remembering that to us, he is an iconic case, he's a story, but to his family, he was a son and a cousin and a nephew. I think that's essential. His family members are still here, and they deserve for us to continue to say his name and continue to tell his story, not just as a cautionary tale, but a love story, a story about what it means to keep a loved one's name alive long after they're gone.
Well, thank you both so much for joining me, and thank you to the audience for participating. This was such an amazing and enlightening and insightful discussion. To round everything out, I'm going to pass it back to Cameo.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation exploring the role of the media in shaping public perception around the murders of African Americans. The Murder of Emmett Till is available to stream now in full on our website, the PBS video app, and on our YouTube channel. You can watch our past forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations and screening opportunities. Thank you again for joining us today.